I want to move on to the president's executive order on immigration. He is considering maybe doing another executive order. What's your view about that? Do you think it's possible to do with a tighter?
No. I think he ought to throw it in the trash. I think this executive order is so bad and so poisoned, and its genesis is so bad and terrible that he ought to just throw it in the trash can, and for two reasons. First reason, it doesn't really make us safer. It doesn't focus on the areas where we really need to tighten up. They are, number one, on lone wolves. The last two major terrorist incidents in America didn't occur through immigrants. They were Americans importuned by the evil ISIS. And no less an authority than John McCain, Republican, has said that this order actually encourages lone wolves. And the second is something called the Visa Waiver Program. It's very easy to come to America from countries that we have always regarded as friendly. There are, I think, 27 of them. But these days, there are would-be terrorists who have infiltrated places like Belgium and France, and they can come into this country much more easily than someone who's a refugee from the 7 countries the president mentioned. That needs real tightening up. The second reason this order is so bad, John, is it's just un-American and unconstitutional. A religious ban just goes against the American grain. We believe in immigrants in this country, and we don't believe in a religious test. And finally, it hurts us economically. When immigrants don't come to this country, it hurts our job creation, our job growth. Silicon Valley is very worried that a lot of their jobs are going to have to go to Vancouver, where Canada has a much more forward-looking immigration policy.
But let me ask you this, Senator. Why not just have a pause? I mean, we do know in Europe that that ISIS has tried to get into the refugee program. They've had issues there. Isn't it okay for a president to come in and say, hey, let's take a look at this vetting. We'll have a little bit of a pause here. There's nothing wrong with that, is there?
Well, first, it's not a pause for Syria. And second, it cuts against the grain of what America's all about, which is it embodies a religious test. That's how Rudy Giuliani set it up. That's how that's how President Trump talked about it. And it doesn't focus on the areas that need to make us safe. The 3 judges in the panel said they've shown no evidence that our safety is at risk or rather, they've shown no evidence that this executive order would make us safer.
Let me say, Rudy Giuliani, I think, said he was moving it away from a religious test. But let me move on to just working with Donald Trump in general. The majority, the Democratic leader in the House, Nancy Pelosi, said as long as the president continues down this path, she met with the various policies he's promoting, there is nothing Democrats can work with him on. Is that your view, too? That's it? Nothing? Can't work with him on anything?
Well, let me say this. We'll be guided by our values. Our values guide us. We're not going to say no to President Trump on things we might totally agree with. An easy example. He calls for closing the carried interest loophole, something Democrats have stood for and Republicans have opposed. We're not going to say no because his name is on it. But he has moved so far away from moderate positions. You know, he campaigned as a populist against the Democratic and Republican establishments, but he's governing as a hard right guy. And his values are so far away from ours, it's hard to see where he would cooperate, where we could cooperate with him. You know, his cabinet, hard right, not populist, bankers, billionaires, conflicts of interest, people who want to end Medicare, people who demean workers,
let me
things
ask you
like
though,
that.
Senator, what you talk about your values, but you've also got your voters. You've got people protesting in front of your house that say resist or resign. It looks like the situation in the Democratic Party is that Democrats can never cooperate with the president for fear of their voters punishing them for not resisting him on everything.
Well, let me say this. First, I think the fact that there are protests is a great thing. I've never seen such energy in the streets since the Vietnam War, and people are truly worried about President Trump. I spent 4 hours at the Women's March in New York. About 20% of the people there, I queried, hadn't voted. So this new energy is a great thing. Are there going to be brickbats occasionally? Sure. But the Democrats and so many Americans are united in opposing Trump in where he's going, that I think overall it's an extremely positive thing.
Let me ask you a specific case on the Supreme Court nominee, Judge Neil Gorsuch, which the president has put forward. You wrote in the New York Times that he, quote, refused to answer rudimentary questions in your interview with him, and you said that was a real challenge. But both Democratic and Republican nominees for that court spot in the past have refused to answer questions all the time. That's what they do. So this doesn't seem to me to be something that's particularly new for a Supreme Court justice or one that's been nominated to refuse to answer questions they might have to rule on if they get on the bench.
Okay, what's particularly new, John, is that we have a president who is overreaching dramatically, who shows little respect for rule of law, who seems to violate the Constitution in his first 3 weeks, and intimidates judges who have cases before them. This demands a new standard, a much more independent justice than in the past, because after all, the Supreme Court is our last refuge against a president who overreaches, who doesn't respect balance of power. Now, I sat with Judge Gorsuch, and I said, show me you're independent. He said, well, I am independent. I said, show me. And I asked him some very specific questions that he should answer. These are not about existing cases. I said, if there was a law that said all Muslims are banned from the United States, would that be unconstitutional? That has nothing to do with the case before him, or before us, before the court. He wouldn't answer. I asked him, what's his opinion of Citizens United, an awful case, or the Shelby case, which undid voting rights? He wouldn't answer. I asked him, what's his view of some conservative legal scholars who have said President Trump should not attack?
Let me ask you quickly, Senator.
So he wouldn't answer anything. I just want to say one more thing. I had the eerie feeling I was sitting just the same as with Judge Roberts when he was a judge. He wouldn't answer any questions. He said he'd call balls and strikes. He got into office. He became an activist judge and moved the country far to the right, favoring special interests over working people.
Final question, Senator. Just he did mention, though, that he thought it was disheartening that the President Trump's comments about the judiciary. And if you look at his record, he has clashed with the idea of giving deference to the executive branch on regulatory questions. So if you look at his record, he has not, he's shown separation from the executive and his words as well.
Well, I asked him, would he publicly condemn what President Trump did with the existing judge, which any judge worth his salt should do. He refused. He said to me, I'm disheartened. Now, his handlers were sitting there and they whispered, you can make that public. So this was not, you can't behind closed doors, you can't behind closed doors whisper to a senator and then not say anything. And then when President Trump attacked and said he didn't mean me, they all said, yeah, he didn't mean President Trump. That was a further indication of his lack of independence.
All right, Senator, we're going to have to leave it there.
Sure.